Thank you. Now we'll start 30 minutes of group discussion. I'm going to kick it off by asking, so I want to stipulate that from a sustainability standpoint, money will always be at the center. So let's set the money equation to the side. I'd like to get to some of the other sustainability challenges. And really from each of your perspectives, if you were to say that, what's one thing we need to solve for as a community? Money aside, if there was just one challenge that from either as a funder or from a business or from NIH's perspective that we've got to solve for this if we're going to make progress around sustainability, what would it be?
Do we go left to right or right to
Whichever
left?
you like. Go ahead.
Well, I'm going to go from the platform perspective. I'm not going to try to speak for NIH. But I think from a platform perspective, it would really be a metadata standard that would, I think, both accelerate discovery and also set us up for that long-term kind of accounting for growth type of aspect.
So
metadata standards. I mean, it'd be nice to have data harmonized, things like that, But I would, if I had to start anywhere, it would be with the metadata.
So I agree with that. I think, for the industry, especially pharmaceutical industry, most of them follow standards, because there are standards available. I think if the academics, because the CDISC is for everybody, if everybody would start to follow that standard, we would have a really good base to start. It's not complete, but it is far better than doing your own, as industry follows the CDISC standards for the most part. So once you have that, then the next step, I think as I said in my last comment, without having all of these platforms talking to each other or being in one place, having all of the data in one place, you are sub-optimizing most of the times what you can do. Because you have really trials of the data from different companies, and you can't take the data out of each of these and try to combine. It's just massively problematic. So with the standards and the metadata and data in one place, I think would be the way to go to solve the problems or actually come up with insights that might be helpful for doing further research or understanding what is done before.
Yeah, I mean, I felt, as you saw from my slides, which were prepared before today, that it's standard. So I agree, a lot of focus on that. But actually what I'm hearing from a lot of the discussions already this morning and this afternoon is perhaps more, there's an issue over ownership of an entity, of a body that really drives this and brings everyone together. And I think nobody has taken that role is what I'm hearing. And it seems like we're having meetings after meetings, and maybe there's a slight fatigue that's setting in that I'm hearing, which I think is dangerous because we've made so much progress already. It would be such a shame to lose momentum at this stage. But maybe actually a sort of international recognized body that everybody feels they can buy into, that will drive the standard setting and convene everyone together. And I don't know who that is, but I'm wondering if that might be our key next step.
It's an interesting concept I'd like to come back to. We have some questions, so go ahead. It'll get there. Give it a second.
Yes. First, a response to what Georgina was just saying about that international body talking about data interoperability, and data standards. There are some groups out there who are having these conversations right now, although they might not be as broadly recognized as one might hope for. One of these is the Research Data Alliance, who has specific working groups on and industry groups exactly on these topics of thinking about metadata standards for particular fields, one of those being health, although not the narrow clinical trial data standards, but certainly that would be a welcome conversation there, and it's where funders, governmental organizations, researchers come together and are having these conversations right now. So I encourage everyone to look them up and start joining them if you haven't already. My question actually was for Pandren Kulkarni. Regarding the number for the 3 million, slightly over 3 million that you've spent on data management, what percentage of your overall research budget does that represent?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know.
Ballpark.
I guess the company spends about $5 billion per year on R&D. So
minuscule then.
Yes, but it is $3 million that could have gone to develop a molecule. So I don't think it is, you can neglect it. As long as it is used properly, I think it's a phenomenal use. And I don't think we have a problem spending that money. My point was, let's make sure that we utilize what we have put out there.
Absolutely support that. My minuscule was not to denigrate the amount spent, but to acknowledge what a small proportion, in fact, it was that was being sent to get these perhaps outsized returns on those data and on those efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Matt Sides here. So we've heard about 5 data sharing platforms today that are involving industry, plus an extra one from an academic organization. Of those 5, it looks like Lilly's putting data into 3 of them. I don't know if it's different trials that go into these different repositories. I'd love to know how you make a decision. If I was to apply for a Lilly data set, which route should I take? Of the 5, I think it looks like the independent review is being organized for 2 of them by the Wellcome Trust. And again, maybe a question to Georgina, if a trial is in more than one of those data sets and I could come to you for either of those pathways, which pathway should I take to gain data? Just think about sustainability. Do we need this many? I mean, what's the route forward here?
Yes, it's right that the Wellcome IRP is providing the service for both CSDR and Vivli. They are identical criteria. So I can tell you because we had already got the criteria established for CSDR. So then when Vivli asked if we can provide the service, we just duplicated. It's the same panel exactly, and it's the same criteria they use on both platforms. What I think people might not see is the effort that is going on behind the scenes to make sure those 2 things are linked. So because I'm the single point of contact between the 2 platforms in terms of the IRP, I in fact talk, and what we see is researchers sometimes applying to both places simultaneously, but not telling each of the platforms, but it's okay because we pick that up, so I spot. And then, of course, what we don't want to do is have the IRP consider the same essential proposal twice, because, by the way, there's a charge for that. So it's £650 each time the IRP consider a proposal, and then that gets charged back, which is part of the 3 million that's covered by people like Lilly. So we try and make sure that that's not charged twice for the same proposals going through. I don't, beyond the other platforms as well, I don't know that. I mean, I think it's probably just to clarify, Lilly is not listing on CSDR and Vivli simultaneously. They were on CSDR, now they've moved to Vivli. So there's a cut-off point at which studies come down from one platform and then go up onto the next. And we try and make that transition smooth, and it's happened with a couple of other companies as well. But you might argue that a consistent single IRP considering proposals from multiple platforms is a good thing. I mean, I think what we've found at Wellcome is that a lot of the clinical trials we fund occur in centres that have built their own data access committees. One could argue on the independence level of those access committees and whether that's something that we should, push further on the agenda, but they've developed of their own natural organic processes. And so you might argue that, as I say, an independent panel is more consistent across the range of platforms, but obviously it's up to the platform and the members of each platform which access route they want to choose, right?
So I think there are 2 points. One, yes, you are right. We are playing with everybody who is doing the data transparency, because in the early days, we didn't know who is going to be actually the platform that's going to happen. So we said any data transparency that was happening, we were willing to support them. So as we have supported, we have Transcelerate, we have DataSphere, and we have Wellcome Trust, and all of these are there. That was my point earlier, that now that we are seeing these and people are popping up again and again, it's going to be tiring for us to do this for many places. So it would be really good to have some platform, one IRP or many IRPs. I don't really, that part is less of a burdensome for us than the platform. Because I have to put the data in different platforms, that's actually cost every single time. Whereas if we could put the data in one platform and all the IRPs that they are reviewing, they just point it to one place, that would be the ideal. So if the data sphere, transfer rate, and all of these can get together and say, let's build one platform, this is good for the public, and let's all come and work together. I guess that's hard, but you have to do at some point what's hard, not what's easy. And that, I think, will be the thing that will make this much more sustainable. Otherwise, you are going to have more people coming up, and then it's going to be not sustainable. We're going to have to start to say, we can't support you, we can't support you, we can't support you, and then we're going to have unhappy customers.
Don Grusula, Ohio State University, and the Alliance for Clinical Trials in Oncology. In your different organizations, data use agreements, what variability is there in your policies and procedures for authorship in addition to the ICMJE criteria?
For us, we don't control the authorship once we give the data. It's up to the researchers how they do it. We don't look for credit except to say this is Lilly data, but Lilly sponsored clinical trial. But otherwise, researchers do the proposal and they publish, and it is up to them who they give credit to. We don't become authors on that publication at all. We are completely hands-off. We simply make sure that the data is there, and then the research proposal makes sense to a certain extent, although IRP is actually the main body that looks at that. So from a sponsor perspective, we are simply hands-off for the most part.
David Sampson from American Society of Clinical Oncology. I have a question around data preservation. So in the journals world, all of the journals participate in journal preservation. So if a journal were to go dark, institutions and end users could still access the files, the content through various preservation archives. Is this something that Wellcome or Lilly or NIH are looking at? And I asked that in the context of one of the meetings that we had at ASCO, and someone asked the various data platforms that were on the panel whether or not data preservation was something that they were considering should something happen to their data platforms, whether they lose funding or can't sustain themselves.
I cannot talk about the platform, this middle platform, but from Lilly perspective, and for any other company, pharmaceutical company, we have to preserve the data for so long based on the regulations anyway. And then even when that regulation requirement, I think is 15 years or so, is done, we still archive the data, and it is retrievable for the most part. And we have high security protection for the data because that's our asset. Data is our asset, and that makes the molecule happen. So from our perspective, data is pretty well preserved. It's just it may take time and money to get it back if it is too old.
I guess from our particular platform, I'm not sure if this is really getting at your question, but we do use accession numbers with versioning, and so especially like a number of studies they'll get updated over time, and so those older editions, they will be archived, but you can go back and reference kind of any previous archive through the accession number.
But I do wonder if this raises a question about standardization of preservation, because obviously for Lilly it's an asset. There's a lot of fiscal responsibility tied up there, but that's not necessarily the motivator for others. And so there could be very important data sets that then are lost to history, which I think is the point that you're making. Jeff?
So first, I had two separate questions. First, I want to make sure that I understand the differences among the presentations that we heard concerning the cost. We got an estimate, I'm going to ballpark, of £5,000 to archive a data set. And from Sean, I think I got an estimate that's like much larger than that. And I'm trying to figure out whether you were looking at the incremental cost or the cost of setting it, of doing it once the data have been created in a way that makes them easy to archive, versus our current setting where everybody's doing it their own way and then somebody tries to harmonize it, which is like much more expensive. So can you all sort of tell me what, if you were the NIH and the NIH is talking about data, allowing data sharing costs, what would that be? And how do you figure that out? It's a question for the panel at large. I mean, you've all given us estimates, but they seem to be wildly different unless I'm missing something.
Yeah. I think that represents the current understanding within the academic sector in terms of people taking a guess about what the costs are going to be, because they're only just working it out at the moment, and some people have got no idea, which is why we see in our grant application forms nothing included in that, probably because they don't even know what the cost is, right? I think we deliberately do not specify any amounts because we wanted to leave it flexible in terms of people saying for their specific project it will cost this much, and that's what's important for that project. Because I mean, we fund projects where they're actually establishing their own collaborative new repository. Now that's going to cost loads more than a single study that will just want to, say, share through Vivly at the end, which will cost them a fixed fee of $2,000 or whatever it is. But this is all new. I think it's just that up till now, nobody's filled in any of those costs because they haven't been required to definitely do that. It's not mandated. What our current mandate is to share the data behind a publication at the point of publication. And mostly, there are free options for people to put that. So their institutional repository, which, maybe are not, we could argue about the suitability of those for clinical trial data, or they've just basically kept, like Rebecca was saying, the default at the moment is to just keep the data themselves, and then the cost of that is nothing until they get a request. And then sometimes they just don't respond to the request, so that still costs nothing. So maybe, they're right in putting nothing in the application form, but it's about shifting the culture and working out what the costs are. I don't think, they're wildly heterogeneous because that's reflective of the current state of affairs. But you're right, sorry, the Catherine Tudor-Smith article was specifically looking at going back to a legacy data set and just curating it a little bit more to make sure it's metadata labels and so on ready for sharing. So that was just a top-up amount rather than the whole cost of the data managers within the whole trial.
I would agree with that totally. We've done those exercises as well, but in terms of legacy data sets, and it depends on what you have that you're starting with, kind of what the Play-Doh is like right now to what you can mold it into. From an investigator standpoint, initiating, say, a new large study, whether it be a new large clinical trial, I think they really do take those costs into consideration as they're putting together. They're thinking about this forward thinking, kind of in terms of this whole data management process that they're going to have to deal with. I think that's a component to it. But that's with the large studies. With the smaller studies, I really just don't know. Some may be thinking of certain, funding thresholds. Well, I'm not going to cross those thresholds, so they'll either leave it out, or, that's 4 years from now. I'll worry about it then. I really don't know. I think it's a great question, though.
So my second new topic question, and it's mostly directed to you, Sean, it has to do with archived data sets. After a while, what happened in the 1980s becomes of historical value rather than a value to our thinking currently, because the entire ecology of things has changed. And if you look at how heart attacks were treated from 1985 to 1995, it's totally different from how they were treated from 2009 to 2019. So do you have data on the use of historical data sets that are more than 10 years old, the people coming to use those? And are they mostly historians, or are they active researchers?
No, I think like Solved, you might be able to help me with that one. Solved was probably ended in '98, I want to say. But that is still being used.
Yeah.
It's still being actively requested, still being used to consider various associations. We have, I think some of the other ones like, say, cabbage, some of those older coronary studies, they are still being used. I don't even think really still within a historical context, but still looking at various associations because that's what that study had. Sometimes those old data, like if you really wanted to put together a risk prediction equation for heart disease, you'd go back to Framingham, before we had good blood pressure meds, before we had good statin, things like that, to really understand what these risk factors means in terms of future disease, So I think there's actually a lot of uses of those old data, even trying out new statistical methods. Sometimes that particular old data set is valid for that use as well. So we keep them, and they're still used.
So to summarize it, you don't believe that there's a time at which you can say a data set will melt?
I haven't seen it yet. We haven't. The only data set we have, quote unquote, kind of retired was that Sprint POP data set, but that's just because we rolled it into the full Sprint. Other than that, everything we've ever released is still there.
I have a question about something that has really barely been touched on, and I could have asked it, I guess, in any of these contexts, to put it in the context of cost. However, individual patients, participants, have rights to their own patient-specific data from trials in nearly all cases, I believe. I think there may be, I've heard at least anecdotally, that there's maybe an uptick in those kinds of requests. Is that the case? And what are the costs of meeting those requests in particular?
Are you talking about patients requesting their data?
Yes, patient-specific data from the trial.
Doesn't matter what the cost is, I guess, if they want it.
Well, I'm just asking, though, is it a cost item?
Don't know about them, but
I'm also
I have
asking,
a lot of requests from patients.
in a large trial, if you have thousands of patients and lots of them want their data, that could be a major cost.
So in our case, what happens is we never contact the patient. It's the investigator who gets the request, and investigator has an obligation to go back to the patient to give them the information that they require or they request. We don't get in the business of having the conversation with the patient because the investigator is the person who deals with the patients in their way. We provide all of the information to the investigators for their patients and for their site, and then they can provide it to the patient as patient requires or needs. I don't know about what happens.
We're a funder. So
Yeah,
that happens at the study level.
Yeah.
I think there's been one instance where the study came back to us and said, this particular person is withdrawing consent, take them out, which of course.
Actually, Alex Sherman, Mass General, I would like to confirm this approach. So when you're part of the things my center does, besides being data center, we run clinical trials as a CRO or academic CRO, research organization. And any trial is supposed to deliver data to each site, so patients' data. And it's almost same cost to deliver PDF files for each record to the site or for each record to a patient. So I think that the tricky part is to know which patient's data to deliver to whom, because most of the data, as you know, organized by subject IDs, and no one knows but the site who this person is. So that's where the tricky part, and sometimes it's the IRBs are not allowing, local IRBs are not allowing to redistribute data to patients this way, because accidentally it could be delivered different subject IDs to different, or to the wrong patients, to the wrong people. And then answering question about how much does it cost to merge data or maintain data. So CPATH many years ago and us, when we were talking about merging data in the same disease space from multiple trials, we calculated about $25,000 to $30,000. So approximately, because you have to harmonize data, map data, clean data, and then merge it together. So CPATH did it in Alzheimer's on many trials. We did it in ALS on many trials, and on average, it's 25 to 30,000. And the last comment, I apologize, but there were too many comments. So for the NIH, for us to upload data to the NIH, our challenge is that there are no standards. So basically, we're uploading whatever we want. So, and that's the challenge for those who are downloading data. So, but what we do, we have standardized ways of anonymizing data, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a small trial or large trial, because if it's the same amount of data elements, so, and if it's a good clinical trial with organized data, it takes approximately the same amount of time to anonymize and deliver the data set for, I don't know, multi-site, several thousand patient trial or 20 patient trial.
Is that a question? I mean, is it the same? I guess I want to make sure I understand the question.
I think it's more of a statement, but I guess if
okay.
you have a...
Yeah, it was a statement. So basically, mapping is what takes time and anonymization. But as soon as it's there and all the SOPs are in place, it doesn't matter whether it's 1,000 records or 20 records. It's just programming, just pushing the button.
Although we do put in a lot of manual, there's a lot of manual effort because you're sitting there comparing the metadata to the real, you know, is it actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, you know?
Yeah, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
Assuming that the data of accomplished, finished clinical trials are clean.
Yeah, even then, the assumption is a big assumption. It's not simple. Sorry.
Well, I want to thank our panel for an excellent discussion, and we've hit on some really terrific themes. I noticed metadata, standardization of metadata, continuing to address this cost issue, preservation of data, some important themes that came out to inform our conversation tomorrow. Let's give our panel a round, and then we'll take a break.